not always very bright. They go the wrong way. One of my favorite little kind of throwaway sentence in Scripture is in Isaiah 35. If you don't know what that is, it's that great picture of God will make a road in the desert, the wilderness will bloom, and there will be this road, and the people will travel on it, and nobody will be afraid, and everybody will be safe. No one, not even fools, will go astray. And I just love that. Not even fools. Just be good, there's hope for me. But sheep do that. They go the wrong way. They need rescuing. They're prey to lion. If you read 1 Peter, it talks about the prowling, roaring lion. And you see, what we often think about when we think about sheep and flock is an orderly, gathered together flock in a nice pasture with shady trees. There we go. Oh, what happened? I've lost my sheep. There we go. They're back. So you see, what we think about is what's on the left. It's nice, fluffy, clean. Yeah, how many times have you seen a clean sheep like this in a field? But actually, what we like is more what's on the other side. Biblical metaphors more often tell us about stupid sheep that get in trouble than about nice, fluffy, cuddly sheep that don't. Sheep get lost, they wander off, sheep get stuck. Sheep get scared, actually, in reality. And when they do, they often try and hide behind a rock or a bush, and then they begin shaking and bleating. Scaredy sheep. Shepherds need to find them quickly, because otherwise they might be heard and found by scary animals first. And once found, sheep are often so scared and traumatized that they're struggling to walk, so they need to be carried back to the flock. So you know that the image of the shepherd with a sheep around their neck, that's often a sheep that's got into trouble and has got so scared that the best way to get them back to safety is to put them on your shoulders and carry them back. Sheep have no defenses. They can't bite, they don't claw. Well, they can bite, but it's not very effective. They don't claw, they can't run very fast. The sheep in the wilderness, the sheep in the valley, even the sheep in the nice pastures, their only security is the shepherds. And the shepherds themselves need to go look for the sheep, which is often dangerous, which is why they need a club or a rod and a staff, because sheep don't come out easily and they often need to be rescued. So I always smile when I read the words, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Really? I mean, who here in this room, if they need some comfort, will go, oh, I know what I need, a rod and a staff. What? You know, I'd much rather have a cup of tea, a fluffy toy penguin, and a big bar of chocolate. That would do me a lot better. The rod and the staff represent the expertise and leadership of the shepherd. It isn't fluffy or woolly, it's directive and it's purposeful. Which is quite interesting when we think about the church and our vocabulary of talking of pastoral care, which comes from this type of image, the care of the shepherd. Pastoral care is about using the tools of the shepherd to guide the sheep into the right places. Palestinian shepherds at the time of the psalm usually carried two implements, a club or a rod to fend off wild beasts, and a crook or a staff, like that at the end, to guide and control the sheep. Rod is a word for club, but also for scepter and for tribe in Hebrew. And I really like that. I really like that the word for scepter comes from the implement of the shepherd. The rod is a gathering point for the tribe as well, and a weapon to protect it. There is something very communal and intimate about that. For the Palestinian shepherd, however, the club or the rod is their primary offensive weapon against either wild beasts or human thieves. It was about 2.5 feet long, I can't do feet, so I don't know whether that's 2.5, but never mind. 2.5 feet long, with a mace-like end, with embedded heavy pieces of iron. Not a walking stick, and not particularly comforting. I tried to get a picture to show you, but all the hits I got were either of a shepherd called Rod. Actually, there are loads of them. Oh, I got hits from Warhammer, so I gave up. If you don't know what Warhammer is, either count yourself lucky, or go and ask a friendly teenager near you, and I'm sure they'll tell you in great detail. Interestingly, the rod was also used to count the sheep. So when the shepherd took the sheep back to their enclosure at the end of the day, there was a gate, and they held the rod horizontally towards the floor and got the sheep to jump over, and they counted the sheep jumping over the rod. And that way you could make sure that every sheep was in, but also that every sheep could jump. So that was uninjured after the end of the day. So if one was missing, then the rest could be safely left in the pen while the shepherd went out looking. If one was injured, we would notice at the end of the day and give them care. If the shepherd had to go out looking for a sheep, that's when you might need the crook. The crook helps free sheep from traps, as well as guide them on the right path. So one implement protects from external threats and the other from internal stupidity that leads you to get lost. And I want to show you a little video that hopefully somebody's going to just press a button about what sheep do and what the shepherd's crook does. None of you have ever done that. Isn't it just like human beings, isn't it? Keeping doing the same stupid mistake again and again. My mother was a pharmacist, and one day they had a new pharmacy door put in, and it was a beautiful glass door that was just perfectly clean, so you couldn't see that it was a door. And this man tried to come in and just went whack into the door. So they kind of helped him and he went home. The next day he comes back to the pharmacy. Because they knew that the door was dangerous, they'd now put a sign saying, "Careful, glass door." The man arrived, saw the sign, ducked. Human beings are like sheep. Psalm 23 encourages us to be honest about the reality of being sheep, and also to see the reality of our shepherd. There is a really strong sense of emphatic leadership here. The shepherd feeds, restores, moves the sheep on, makes them behave, going on the right path. There's a sense of movement, of dynamic interaction. The leadership of the shepherd is proactive and firm, and yet deeply and profoundly caring. I think it's something to meditate on in today's world, where we seem to kind of oscillate between really damaging forms of unthinking, unthoughtful, uncaring leadership, and the feeling that we don't want leaders, actually. We can all, we're all big boys and girls and we can make decisions for ourselves. Here we're presented with a different type of leadership that is firm and yet caring, that is very much leadership but entirely self-giving. We might kind of meditate on how this kind of picture of the shepherd here resonates in a world that's wary of authority and abuses of power. How does the good shepherd balance firmness and care? How do we, in our different roles, whether it's in leadership in the church or in other parts of our lives, at work, in families, how do we kind of model ourselves on the shepherd in the Psalms How do we also take seriously the fact that we're not Jesus? Therefore, we are sheep, sometimes called to be shepherds. The mind boggles a little bit. But that's a good question, isn't it? How do we handle that sense of both being leaders and followers of Christ? How do we avoid giving up on the type of leadership we see here because of fear about our own inadequacies and uneasiness about leadership in the church more widely? There's a lot of passages in Scripture that actually sound the alarm about wicked shepherds. If you read the book of Ezekiel, that's quite a bracing read again, but Ezekiel warns against the wicked shepherds, against the power that people have in any form of leadership. But there are also other passages in Scripture that talk about the danger of sheep without a shepherd. How do we balance those two fears and mistakes? I think that's a sharp question for the church today. How do we balance, on the one hand, fear of failures in the church, in leadership, in wider society, failures in caring, abuses of power, and on the other hand, the demands of a deeply individualistic culture where the self and personal agency often trump a sense of collective and belonging and ethic. This psalm helps us try and keep these two things together. But in the face of the fears that our circumstances bring uncertainty within our culture, we have a leadership and presence of God here, as long as we nurture our own following, our own discipleship first. I come from a farming family. I grew up in the country. My grandparents were farmers and had sheep and cattle. And my grandparents were a Catholic family, actually, and therefore had many children. Actually, my grandmother won a little kind of award for helping repopulate France after the Second World War. It's true. She got one after child number 7 and one after child number 10. Anyway, my father has many brothers, and his many brothers love telling the story that it was my father's job to go and watch sheep and cattle during the school holidays. And so there are lots of stories going around about him climbing a tree so he could get a good view of the grazing area, taking out his book and completely forgetting about the animals, and then madly scrambling down 3 hours later and having to spend another 3 hours looking for lost sheep. He wasn't the best of shepherds. Unfortunately, didn't pursue that as a longer-term career. Fortunately, the pastures of France are a little bit safer than those of the Middle East. The shepherd in our psalm isn't just sitting under a tree. He's attentive. He proactively plans for the welfare of the sheep. When later on in the psalm it says, "Goodness and mercy will follow me." That's nice, isn't it? That's pretty wet as a translation from the Hebrew. The Hebrew verb used here for follow me is radaf, and it's a word that's often used to talk about military pursuit, about accounts of pursuing the enemy until you get them. So it's not so much, well, goodness and mercy will take a stroll and have a walk behind me, kind of going along, but rather goodness and mercy will pursue me relentlessly until the end of my life. No matter how much I go astray, no matter what scrapes I get myself into, goodness and mercy will keep coming after me because God will never give up. Isn't that an amazing picture? The words for goodness and mercy are specific attributes for God in the Old Testament. It's about God's covenantal faithfulness and love that keeps coming with the people, that is promised to the people, that ensures we're never alone because God has promised. God has bound himself to the people he loves. The Good Shepherd never stops looking out for his sheep, never stops herding them in the right direction, even when the path goes through the dark valleys. God is present and active to help us find a way through. You can see the connections here, can't you, with the parable of the lost sheep. is this shepherd that would go to any lengths to keep hold of his sheep. And the goodness and mercy of the end of the psalm mirror the care of the shepherd at the beginning, feeding and guiding. The problem is, and always will be, the middle. Because we might want to ask, anchor 3, if God is a good shepherd and in charge and proactively seeking our good, why on earth does he take the sheep through the valley of the shadow of death? They might have wandered off there, but the psalm doesn't say that. The psalm doesn't say the sheep accidentally wandered through the valley. The psalm shows us a shepherd leading the sheep and then moves into the valley. The shepherd, presumably, is still leading. And there is a question there that we can't just escape, that underlies the psalm as a whole. It reminds us that whatever the promise of God's presence is, it doesn't take away the reality of darkness and danger. This psalm doesn't ask the question outright, but there are plenty of other psalms that do. And psalms are not meant to be read in isolation, they're meant to be read together as part of a collection where psalms feed into each other. But in the whole collection, the question why is not answered. It simply holds that tension. God is the good shepherd. But God still comes with us in the valley of the shadow of death. There's something incomprehensible about God's leadership at times. And here we come back to this idea of lament, of balancing out that tension between our perception of reality, the pain, the trauma that we might go through, and the promise that God has given. It isn't like that in lament. Lament affirms both, as I've already said. And lament regularly questions the character of God, together with affirming the character of God. And I wonder how good we are at enabling this creative tension in our churches and communities. How good are we, really, at making space for the unspeakable to be spoken, while still affirming that God cares? What might that look like for Ukrainian refugees? You might have met some, you might have refugees among you. What does making space for lament look like for them? Or for those who can't afford food or heating or both this winter? The tension at the heart of lament makes lament into something much more powerful than just a complaint or an expression of pain. There are two features of laments that are really important. One is impatient patience. Lament is impatient with the reality of the world as it is. It petitions for change, right here, right now. But equally, lament is patient in its refusal to move on until the petition has been heard. Lament doesn't run away from reality into a better place or an easier place, but it dwells in the pain, it names it, it witnesses to it, and takes it to God. It's a little bit like the children's book Barefoot. You know, when it comes to lament, when it comes to pain and trauma, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you've got to go through it. Lament teaches us, all of us, to weep with those who weep, to weep for ourselves, to weep with others, in a culture that actually much prefers endless distractions or escapism, or promises of magic money trees and magic new growth, or a culture that leads us to look for solutions straight away. It's very easy when we see brokenness to try and find solutions rather than sit with it to start with. But I think the sitting and the weeping actually matters, because that's the place where we're reminded that actually we don't need to save the world. The world already has a saviour. The job is taken. Our job is to work with God, where God is already at work. And sitting with those who weep is the first place to be, so we can hear their voices, rather than silence their voices, so that we can feel more comfortable. But lament is also, and crucially, an engine for change. Because lament declares, loud and clear, that normal is not normal. In many of the songs of lament, we hear a cry that says injustice, oppression, inequality, violence, pain, hunger, dispossession, and death are not the way things should be. And lament demands social, political, and personal change in response to what we see. Lament is a place of radical imagination and belief that a different reality is possible. So lament says, well, we might be in the valley, but the valley can be transformed. The honesty and arguing of lament, directed as God, even when we can't see God, is the only way to move from reality and grief into some form of hope. Because hope begins with the renewing of the mind, the transformation of the imagination that helps us see the world not through our human eyes, not reduced to the things we can imagine doing, but through God's immense ability to transform. Lament connects our longings and our imagination with the purposes of God. It isn't politics on its own, it's transformative because of the power of God's Spirit. We need lament if we want to be able to speak words of hope and live lives that foster change and transformation. The hope that arises in lament, and in the Psalms more widely, is a declaration of confidence which is based on two things. It's based on the experience of the dark valley first. It's not blind optimism. It's not saying, I think things will get better. Trust rests on real life experiences. It rests on the memory of what God has done in the past, and it rests on the promise of what God is going to do today and in the future. Memory, I think, is something that we need to cultivate as the people of God. Telling the story of God's faithfulness, not just in Scripture, but in the history of our communities, in the history of our churches, in our own personal histories. Nurturing the memory of God is an essential practice to sustain us in the times of the valley of the shadow of death. The experience of God, what we learned from it, and how we're changed by it is critical. And so it's hardly surprising that Psalm 23 is full of allusions to Israel's corporate memories of their walk with God. The dark valley echoes part of Exodus and travel in the wilderness with God's provision. So confidence in the present of the shepherd, or the sheep rather, is linked to the great acts of divine salvation in the past, the basis of covenant faith. There are lots and lots of words throughout Psalm 23 that remind Israel of the covenant, of the promises of God in Exodus and other parts of the Torah, like goodness and loving kindness and mercy. Scripture is very realistic about humanity. We, all of us, often only recognize God in hindsight. This psalm, I think, is unlikely to have been written from inside the valley. It's a psalm of hindsight, recognizing God in the past. And that's okay, as long as we don't let the insides die out and become forgotten when we face new things. Keeping our insights alive, keeping remembering, is the foundation of trust for the future. We might want to ask, what stories do we draw on today in our churches and in our lives? What can help us connect the challenges of the present to the memories of what God has done in the past? How do we build practices and habits in our daily lives, in our churches, that can help us and the communities we serve and are part of keep alive the memory of God's action and the memory of God's promises in ways that are not just intellectual, but that are actually embodied and specific to our context? What kind of images might we draw on that would connect to where people are at around us? The idea of a shepherd is quite distant, isn't it? Even the rod on the staff, we have to think a little bit to work out what it means. Are there images that would connect better today? memory, and promise in the Bible are deeply relational and communal terms. Describing God as a shepherd and his followers as sheep is a common metaphor in both Old and New Testament. Israel is again and again referred to as God's flock throughout the Old Testament. And in the New, we all know the images and parables of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. What is striking in this psalm is that there's one sheep. It's quite individual, it's quite personal as a psalm. It's virtually the only point in the Old Testament where the metaphor of sheep and shepherd is used to talk about an individual, with no mention of the rest of the flock. I think often today we hardly notice that, because our society and sadly our churches have become quite individualistic. We're used to think about my faith and my journey with God. But to an ancient reader, it would be really striking. You don't take a sheep out of a pasture alone. A flock is always assumed. You only have a lone sheep if they're lost. So either the sheep is lost, or more likely, the background to the psalm is that this is one sheep as part of a flock. And so this psalm affirms actually something quite important for a culture that was quite communal, which is that sheep each have a relationship with the shepherd, even if they're part of a wider flock. And so we have to balance out that individual and group kind of identity and relationship. We see that assumption partly through the echoes of the story of Israel. What is remembered as the basis of trust in the psalm is not just individual experience, it's the experience of the whole people of God. We need both individual and communal faith. Individual relationships with God and a relationship together with God. And that's about enabling individual people to locate themselves in the bigger story, and making it their own is one of the calls of the psalm. But making the story our own involves a bit of a challenge, because this psalm, like many others, calls for a bit of a radical reshaping of the imagination, a rethink of how we see the world and its dangers. First, this psalm kind of shapes and reshapes expectations. We live in a culture where we expect life to be quite smooth. My daughter goes to a very good secondary school, and they have assemblies every day, and often they invite inspirational guest speakers for assemblies. And one of the messages that you often get from these inspirational speakers, I've never been one, by the way, but I'm not inspirational, really. But one of the messages that the kids often get from the speakers is, you can be everything you want to be. You just have to work hard enough. What a complete load of rubbish. Of course we can't. None of us can be everything we want to be. I can tell you with absolute certainty that I could train for the next 150 years, I still would not make an Olympic 100-meter champion. I'm too short, too stocky, and frankly far too lazy to be able to do that. But our society is constantly telling our children that the world is their oyster, that there are limitless possibilities, that if they don't like something, whether it's about the world, their communities, or themselves, or their bodies, well, that's fine, just change it. We're giving them false hopes. And the problem is that our expectations shape our imagination of what the world is and how we should inhabit it. And when things go wrong, and those expectations prove worthless, our entire world can be shattered. If you read around the area of trauma and mental health challenges, you'll find that the gap between our expectations of what life is and should be like and reality is a huge source of distress. The bigger the gap, the more my world of meaning collapses in the face of adversity. I'm not advocating a world with no aspirations, but I think our expectations and the expectations we build up in our children and young people are better built and an honest look at ourselves and at the world. And I think Psalm 23 tells us the world is a hard place, with enemies and wild beasts prowling, where sheep are prey, where dark valleys are inevitably part of the journeys, and because you're sheep, you're also going to make mistakes that are going to affect you. It tells us we take wrong turns, get lost, get ourselves in trouble. It tells us we need our shepherd. This truth isn't meant to be depressing or shattering. It's meant to be the foundation for hope and the way in which we choose to live our lives. It's a foundation for the practices we need to engage in, like telling the story of God's actions, like meeting together as the people of God to encourage one another. So we can meet the dark valley with both fear and trust that God is with us. Again, what kind of spaces can our churches make for radical truth-telling about our communities and our wider world? How can we help that message about the truth of the world to be held within the much stronger, much wider, much more solid container of the love and kindness of God? That our young people do not have to fear because they can't be everything they want to be. That who they are is loved by God. Who they become, even if they make mistakes, even if things are difficult, can still be loved and precious and valued and contribute. Truth without love is unbearable, but we worship the God of love, and truth is held gently in God's hands. Secondly, in this psalm, our imaginations are reshaped by the encouragement to trust in our shepherd rather than in our own clever themes and schemes and strategies. God feeds the sheep even in difficult environments. Now, you may not notice this. Often we assume that there's the nice kind of pasture at the beginning, then we go through the valley, and then we come out of the valley, and then there's a table with my enemies. Right? That's not what the psalm says. We're never told that we come outside of the valley of the shadow. The image of the table that God lays for us is still within the context of the dark valley. And we know that because you lay a table for me before my enemies. The enemies, the dark valley, all the dark stuff, the difficult stuff is still there. God's presence and care is in the middle of the valley, not outside of it. We don't need to come out of it to find God's redemption, God's care, God's love. God can transform the valley and be with us through it. The valley is also an appeal to the imagination of the wilderness. And wilderness images in Scripture are always images of transformation, a reshaping of our imagination. The wilderness is where our idols get smashed, where our false idea of who God is and of who we are get broken down and transformed. Oops. Hey. There we go. Our computer went off for me. One of the main images of the desert is that of the people of Israel who have come out of Egypt and are taken into the desert. Now, if you stop and think for a minute, you think, gosh, those people have experienced slavery for 400 years. They're traumatized. They're refugees. They have nowhere to be. Actually, in the landscape of the time, for a rural agrarian society, unless you have land that you can farm, you die. It is that simple. You need land, and you need good enough land to be able to do something with it. And you would think that if you're going to take a people out of slavery, you would take them into a safe place, wouldn't you? But what does God do? God takes the people out and leads them into the desert. Why? And I think the why is partly what happens next, which is a complete reshaping of Israel's imagination. One of the things that would have been the easiest thing in the world to do for the people coming out of Egypt would be to physically go out of Egypt, but in their minds and their imagination take Egypt with them. So that they would go out of Egypt, but the minute they were somewhere safe, they would reproduce Egypt in a slightly different way. Instead of them being slaves, they might be the masters. Instead of the Egyptians driving them to work, they might drive other people to work. Egypt has a certain social imagination about it, a way of doing things. And the really, really difficult thing, particularly for traumatized people, is to find that instinct of making yourself safe at any cost. it would have been really easy for the people to try and make themselves safe at any cost. Instead, God takes them into the desert and cares for them in the desert and gives them space for their imagination to be changed. There's two things that are done to enable that. The first one is the manna in the desert, where God feeds the people. And God enables manna to come at night, and the people are allowed to take what they need for their family, for the day, and no more. That's quite extraordinary. If you had been oppressed, driven to despair, maybe not had enough to eat for most of your life, the most natural thing to do in the world would have been to see the manna and take as much as you could, and try and store it for tomorrow, just in case, and try to have as much as you could get for yourself. Instead, the people are told, no, you can't do that, because that's the way Egypt works. The way Egypt works is that everybody takes everything they can for themselves. The way Egypt works is that they believe there isn't quite enough to go round between everybody. Therefore, those who are stronger and fitter will take everything they can at the expense of everybody else. Here in the desert, in the place of absolute and utter scarcity, God is saying there is abundance. And we need to reshape your imagination, not to imagine the world as a place of scarcity, but as a place of enough. So everybody is allowed to take enough manna. That means that not everybody gets the same amount. They take what's needed for their appetite, for their bills, for their family, for whatever. But you take enough and no more. And that's a challenge to the people to reshape their imagination as well of the difference between what we desire and what we need. The imagination of the people is getting them ready for a different type of society. A society where nobody takes for tomorrow the bread that somebody else needs today. And the other thing that God does to reshape the people's imagination is to enforce the idea of the Sabbath. So on Friday evening, the people are allowed to gather enough for 2 days' worth of manna, rather than one. And that's the only time they're allowed to store, because the Sabbath matters. If you think about it, the Sabbath is the exact opposite of Egypt. When the people were in Egypt, they were made to work every day. They were made to work every hour of the day. The kind of motto of Egypt actually was productivity. We're going to get as much out of these people as we can possibly get. There is not going to be space. There's not going to be generosity. There's not going to be anything. You just have to be efficient, and your usefulness is defined by your ability to produce. In the desert, the people are told to stop. Again, it would have been tempting, wouldn't it, in the desert, to try and make every moment count, to try and say, we can't afford to just stop and not keep moving towards the promised land. We can't afford to risk staying here where there might not be enough water tomorrow. But the people are made to stop. They're made to realize that actually work and production do not define them, that there is more to being a human being than producing stuff. And that goes together then with the laws that the people are given to order their life together once they get out of the desert. If you read the laws of Jubilee in Leviticus, you may not read Leviticus as a bedtime story, but there are lots of good things about Leviticus. I could talk about that for hours. But some of the really interesting thing about Leviticus are things like the laws around gleaning. When you plant your field and when you harvest, don't be efficient. Don't get every last bit of grain. Leave enough so that those who don't have enough for themselves can be there. Build generosity within the fabric of your economy. What would that look like if we did that today? What would it look like if instead of trying to get every penny out of every worker, out of everything that we do, we made a space for generosity in everything that we do? I'll get out of Leviticus, otherwise I'll go down lots of rabbit holes. Lots of good rabbits in there. But here, Psalm 23, to come back to the psalm, affirms, I shall not want. The psalm overall sets out that God meets needs. But those needs in the psalm are pretty much food, shelter and security, and freedom from fear and death. There is no sense of riches and material possessions. What I want, what I need, is the presence of God, and then towards the end, dwelling in the house of God. And the challenge for us today is to let our imaginations be shaped by that economy of abundance, with no need for competition for resources, where desire doesn't lead to the accumulation of riches far beyond what we need. And finally, this psalm's most salient challenge to the imagination is in its portrayal of who God is. Now, if you went to other parts of the Psalms, you would find that lots of images used for God have a kind of homeland security feel. Shield, high tower, fortress, high place, refuge, rock, stronghold, horn of salvation. This makes sense. For security reasons, ancient people of the Middle East felt the need to stay in fortified cities and towns on top of hills. Jerusalem is on a mountain. When the town was attacked by raiders, they needed a fortified space higher to take refuge into. But this, on the other hand, could often lead to paranoia, siege mentality, and trying to keep everybody else out. We know what the association of God and military strength has given us in history. It's not a happy history. Therefore, throughout the Psalms and other parts of the Old Testament, there are three deeply countercultural images for God: shepherd, mother, and father. These three images are the only ones that then reappear in the New Testament as images of who God is. God does not lead his people through shows of strength and military power primarily. Even some of the warlike stories of the Old Testament, like Jericho, the walls fall at the sound of a trumpet. They don't have catapults. The shepherd imagery, actually, if you stop and think about it, wouldn't have felt nearly as secure and reassuring as some of the homeland security type of images. And yet, it's the image that has stayed with us as a church. That's the image we remember. Partly because we tend to trust in a person rather than in things. And homeland security is trying to trust in thing rather than in a relationship. When we move into the New Testament, the image of the shepherd is expanded and developed to its full potential. The danger and the evil of the valley that we have here is not just danger for the sheep, but for the shepherd too. Looking for lost sheep is not just like a giant game of hide and seek. It's hazardous and costly. Just look at some of the images again. The image the New Testament gives us is that the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The good shepherd constantly comes looking for us, whether we're lost because we've wandered away through our indecision, or simply lost sight of the shepherd, or become separated from the flock because of external circumstances. The good shepherd looks out for us even before we look for him or think of calling him. The good shepherd risks everything. The reason we fear no evil is because he himself has fought evil and won. But the shepherd has won, not through strength and power, but through an acceptance of vulnerability and limitation. In a strange reversal in the New Testament, the good shepherd has become the sheep, the sacrificial lamb. So when we're called to follow him, the call really is to go through the darkest valley, because he himself did. Because in order to go to the still water and to the table, you have to go through the valley. You can't go under it. You can't go over it. You've got to go through it. And he himself will be with us on the journey.